in Washington. Thank you so much for joining me, gentlemen, today. We're hoping well. There's a lot to digest. This NATO meeting, the G7 meeting beforehand, lots going on. It's hard to really work out what to take on board and what can be talked about because there's a lot of speculation. Paolo, perhaps I could start with you first, sir. With these NATO discussions, with Biden's strong stance and General Jens Stoltenberg's push that the 30 nations are strong together, I think that's kind of the message that they wanted to put across today. Is that right?
Well, yes. As we know, America's top priorities right now are Washington's concerns about China. China and, in a subsidiary fashion, Russia. And certainly Biden's objective, I think, was in going first to the G7, talking about economic and trade and other matters, were to build a united front among the largest Western industrial countries to say China is essentially an existential threat, not a passing problem. And moving from from the UK to Brussels was a statement of a concern that emerged even prior to the meeting from the Secretary General of NATO to say we're watching China with concern, or some words to that effect. So I think something was achieved there, at least in raising the profile of this problem. In terms of practical actions, what are we going to do about all this? That's very complicated. Much is happening here in the United States about repositioning our global supply chains away from China into other countries. But that's a long and complicated process. But can we move together in sync with Europe and Japan and everybody else regarding China on the economic front, and with all the rather composite and complicated, Western alliance? We'll see. This is the first, how can I say, the first installment here. I think it's moderately encouraging, but I wouldn't say that this is a demonstration of an iron-clad commitment. We're all together, and we recognize, and we're all on the same page, and China is our problem, and we all agree on that. We're not there yet.
Okay, Jeff, what are your thoughts? I mean, I know we talked about China. You and I have talked many times about China and U.S. relations. Do you think? I mean, it's the first time that Jens Stoltenberg came out and said, we've actually mentioned China in our, in our communique. I mean, we never talked about China before. It's only 18 months ago we even had them in our communique. So, is it the cyber threat that's the main issue? Is it the arms control that's the main issue? What's the main issue here?
Well, there are a variety of issues. First and foremost, though, Biden's message is that America is back and that America values participation in the international community and alliances are a firm foundation for American foreign policy. So that is why since he has taken office, he has met successively with our various allies, and now he's in Europe to meet with the G7 and now NATO. As for China, we really have a paradigm shift, and we really have the wolf warrior diplomats that have been very aggressive in China to thank for this, because I think all of the countries that are represented at the G7 and in NATO now realize, as the NATO statement says, that China is a systemic challenge to the rules-based international order. That's the language, I think, in the NATO statement. If you look at the G7 statement, the G7 statement talks about China in several respects. It talks about concerns about forced labor without naming China. It talks about human rights in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong. And people in Turkey are particularly concerned about Xinjiang. There are 40,000 Uyghurs in Turkey who are very concerned about that issue. Indeed. The G7 statement calls for a transparent COVID origins study. It also expresses concern about China's non-market policies. And the G7 statement also calls for a free and open Pacific, which involves no significant military changes in the East and South China Seas. So there are a variety of issues there. And this is the first time that this international community is calling them all out.
Right.
And China has a divide and conquer strategy, and you can bet that China will be trying to offer trade concessions to peel off some of the less committed allies. That's the way China plays the game. But going forward, this is a real change, and the Chinese statements in reaction to these developments show that out.
Indeed, indeed. Paolo, how do you think, I mean, like Jeff said here, that China's strategy is to, divide and conquer, if you like. I mean, China has the Belt and Road Initiative, and Biden has come out and said, you know what, we're going to come, the B3W, build back better the world or something like that. It's not as catchy as the BRI, I'm sure. But, I mean, there are some countries, I mean, Italy, for example, is part of the, Belt and Road Initiative, and it's also part of the G7. So I know it's probably a huge, topic, but what are your thoughts on that, Paolo?
Well, look, point well taken. Let's face it, we are about 20 years behind the curve here. We have in the United States and in Washington, and I think on a very strong bipartisan basis, if we go back to the 1990s and the policy of engagement with China, the idea was, oh, these guys are still on the other side of the river, but I guess they're moving, they're crossing, they're coming to us. Communism is really over. The Soviet Union is finished. It's been a bankruptcy of management, of ability to deliver anything, etc. And the Chinese, in due course, will see the light. And therefore, let's open ourselves, let's admit them to the WTO, etc., etc. It's been a long process of engagement, and now we are like betrayed at the altar. Oh my God, my fiancée is really not what I thought she should be. And now there's been a complete reversal, which I think it's really bipartisan now in Washington, which started in earnest under Trump. And quite frankly, there is no dramatic change now with the change of administration come the beginning of this year. Mm-hmm. It's not that Biden said, oh, whatever Trump did was wrong, and now we're going to do it again. No, we're continuing pretty much along, if not the same, similar lines. But as you say, the Chinese have been up this game for many, many years. I've seen firsthand, working for many, many years in Africa, that has become essentially a wholly owned Chinese subsidiary. So can we catch up and offer to other countries, whether those who are part of the Belt and Road Initiative strategy, which are really many, and others, an alternative model, something that says, China is essentially exploitative, and we offer transparency and fair dealings and proper financing of projects without hidden clauses and what have you. Yes, we can. But as I said, we are at least 20 years behind in this approach. I think we can improve for sure. And I would think that many countries will be willing to listen to what the West, led by the United States, has to offer. China has the first mover advantage, if you wish, and having established and consolidated relations with many countries, I would name Pakistan, just to name a big one that everybody knows about. But they're everywhere. They're in Africa, they're in Latin America, they're in Mexico, right, which is literally next door. Yeah. So there is much can be done, and it will be done. And I really think that the Biden administration is strongly motivated to build alliances, recognizing that we need a united front. But as you pointed out, with Italy signing its own side deals and other countries saying, well, let's go slow, let's see what's happening here. This is going to be a long, a marathon. This is not going to be a series of battles, and then we're going to, quote, defeat China. China is aiming at technological supremacy. That's what they're aiming at. And quite frankly, the bill that was just passed by the U.S. Senate just a few days ago, which is about beefing up American R&D potential and opportunities and spending money on research, on greenfield initiatives and what have you, that's that's the long-term strategy. Become once again and reassert our leadership, America's leadership in high technology, and be the provider to the world as we have been for decades in many of the leading technologies that the whole world uses today, from microchips to the internet to whatnot. So can America reassert itself in this role? Absolutely. It will take some time and concerted effort by both the federal government and the private sector to rev up the engine, if you wish, of American innovation, because this is really going to be our best bet and what we can offer the rest of the world.
Indeed. I mean, very well said, sir. Nicely rounded up, too. Jeff, I mean, here we have Biden coming up and saying, basically, we're going to be using a lot of these startup companies, like Paolo said, really, to get people involved in the technology side of things and to really ramp it up. But like Paolo said, I mean, the G7 do seem to be a little bit behind technologically. Can they catch up?
Oh, I think the G7 is ahead in many ways. I don't think that.
All right, okay, you got me. Go.
Technologically, I mean, I think you may be thinking about the area of 5G, where the Chinese have a little bit of an edge, but that gap is being closed very quickly through Open RAN and other kinds of technologies. But in a whole variety of other technologies, the United States is way ahead of China, and that's why China so very much resents getting cut off from American technologies. Chinese companies that are linked to the military and that have dedicated themselves to taking civilian technology and using it for military purposes are being denied those technologies. And that's why China is so resentful of that. As for engagement, though, there are a couple of really big changes to notice. One is we have had the end of engagement. We engaged with China, the United States did, thinking, or with China's promises, that it would become a market-based economy. And China never did that. China is a state-led economy that uses all of the resources of the state of 1.3 billion people to dominate world markets. And finally, I think the West has given up on convincing China to come and use market-based principles. And now there is a more united effort to push back on that. And Biden is a big change from Trump, because Trump was America first, which really meant America alone. And the difference that we're seeing in this week or so in Europe is that now all the Western countries are coming together and going to try to be working together. Will it be clean and neat and have immediate results? Probably not. It gets a little bit messy. And your example of Italy shows that there are people that have cross allegiances. So this will take time to iron itself out. You can't change all these things in a day. But I do think that we are at a turning point here, and that the challenge that China presents has been recognized rhetorically for the first time, and that we are going to see action that's going to move forward into the future. And I think in the future, we'll look back to this as a turning point.
Indeed, indeed. Paolo, let me, I'm enjoying our conversation. I've got my director saying cut, but I'm going to ignore him. It's just the three of us just now, right? So how are we what are our thoughts when we're looking at, I mean, we talked about China. How important is the Russian threat? Is it a Russian threat? Are we going back to I mean, Jens Stoltenberg came out and said basically it's the lowest point since the end of the Cold War. It's very dramatic, very sort of, you know, cloak and dagger. But are we really looking at problems like that, Paolo, or can things get worked out? Could we even think that Russia would get invited into NATO again? Is that a possibility?
Well, that's a pretty long shot at this time, considering that its role, which is malignant role, really, at the periphery of NATO countries. Let's not forget Georgia. Let's not forget Ukraine. Let's not forget cyber attacks, whether they are against Ukraine or Estonia or other countries, and of course here in the United States. So the problem with Russia compared to China is different in terms of the magnitude of the issues. However, there is the problem of proximity, because Russia is right there at the borders of NATO. And so it creates different types of thoughts and sensitivities and concerns among some NATO members, certainly, and the United States as the country leading the alliance. Can all these things be patched up? some of the issues that concern Russia, which is this obsession about its own deep, how can I say, in other words, about having a buffer at its frontiers. And the crazy idea that is bandied about in Russia almost every other day, that just about to be attacked by NATO, which is kind of funny, ludicrous, but it has strong currency. That basically that whatever Russia does at its periphery, at its borders, are defensive measures to counteract NATO's aggression, which is mysterious, but people actually say this, and they say it every day. So can we find common ground on these matters? It's complicated. There is also the issue of Crimea, which certainly has not been resolved. This is a unilateral annexation after an invasion. And can we just paper over this and say, well, okay, you're forgiven. It's okay. After all, most people who live in Crimea are ethnic Russians. So, give or take a few details, you can take it and keep it. I don't think so. This is a matter of principle of international law. You don't change borders, with via military action, and more. Of course, the cyber threats and the vandalism of the Russians in operating, almost with impunity here in the United States is well known. We know that the ransomware attacks that hit many American companies just in the last few days originate from Russia. We cannot really say for sure that they are ordered by Mr. Putin, but it would appear that these entities that are the agents of all this somehow have some level of safe haven in Russia. So all these things are really troubling. However, there's one element where I believe Moscow and Washington will seek and probably find common ground, and that is strategic weapons, nuclear weapons arsenals.
The START program.
We are, for better or worse, the largest nuclear powers in the world. And it is a shared interest, I think, on both sides, to find some degree of stability in the level of these arsenals. So we have agreements, we've got other things, but so that's one area where common ground, I think, can be found. And then, of course, there's miscellaneous other things. There's Libya, there's Syria, there's other matters.
Honestly, we could talk about this for hours, the three of us, I'm sure, but I am now getting some static in my ear, unfortunately, gentlemen. We will wrap it up suddenly. Jeff, if you don't mind, let me quickly, do you think, we've got just a couple of more minutes here, do you think that again, General Stoltenberg came out, the General Secretary came out and said basically Ukraine and Georgia could be part of NATO down the line. What do you make of that?
I think that's potentially very controversial territory, given what we just talked about with regard to Russia. It's certainly thinkable, but given all the tensions that we have with Russia right at the moment, I think it would be better to cope with those before we start thinking about expanding NATO and provoking something that may be even more dangerous. So I think for the time being, Biden would be right to push back on Russia along the lines that was just described, and move along in that fashion and see how things go. Remember, he's only been in power for 100, 150 days, so he has enough time to figure out all those kinds of questions.
4 years does go quite quickly, as we've seen, and we know how it is in America, how things change just in an instant. But that's another subject. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Paolo von Schirach and Jeff Moon, both of you in the Washington DC. I loved it. The pleasure was all mine, and thank you again, sir. And I hope to see you again on Anews one day. Thank you.
Thank you.